G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. There's been a mid-air collision at a helicopter joyride fixed base operation at the Gold Coast, and I'm going to do a little bit of piracy.
We begin tonight with extraordinary video that's emerged from inside one of the helicopters involved in a deadly crash on the Gold Coast. It was filmed by tourists who survived the horrifying ordeal and provides a much clearer picture of how the two aircraft collided. And we warn some viewers may find these pictures confronting.
A joy flight over Southport turns into a terrifying nightmare. Pilot Michael James tapped on the shoulder by a passenger, seemingly unaware another helicopter was on a collision course. The rotor blades smashed through the cockpit, glass shattering over passengers. Everyone on this helicopter survived. On board 4 tourists from New Zealand and a woman from WA. The pilot managing to land with catastrophically damaged controls. Watching it all unfold from below, Ron and Tracy Drevlak. They were walking their dog just 10 minutes before the horror unfolded, almost directly above them. With no concern for his safety, Ron was one of the first of many who raced to help. Seen it all happen, watched it fall out of the sky, and watched it hit the ground. And the noise and the thud of it hitting the ground, I cannot get it out of my head. He sprinted to the destroyed chopper, now on its roof. Videos recorded from the sandbar are too distressing to show. The scene was frantic.
Your nerves? Good. Well, go help. Go and do what you can.
6 people were inside. 4 could not be saved, including British couple Ron and Diane Hughes. The first person I saw was, I think it was Ron. We cut the seatbelt, we pulled him out and pulled him away, but there was a lot of panic, a lot of people yelling. Ron then ran to the other side of the mangled wreck. That's when I heard Winnie. She was just screaming. Fuel was leaking onto her, so rescuers grabbed buckets, whatever was nearby, and started pouring cool seawater inside. Don't worry, I said, help's on the way. I said, it's only water. I said, we're just trying to dilute the fuel. This must be traumatic for you. It is. It's traumatic. Alongside 36-year-old Winnie, her 9-year-old son Leon. This is him being pulled from the wreckage by the pilot of the second helicopter. Michael James had somehow managed to land his crippled aircraft on the sandbank. Surviving pilot, he was very dazed and confused. I don't think he could actually believe what had happened. His friend and colleague Ash Jenkinson was dead. He said to me, he said, oh, he's actually all right. Is he all right? Yeah, I knew he was gone. It was horrifying, really horrifying. No words, really. Also inside the wreck, Vanessa Tadros. This was her and son Nicholas moments before they took off. Her injuries were so severe she couldn't be saved. The 10-year-old remains in hospital. Husband and father Simon watched it all unfold. Posting on social media, Nicholas is in a very serious and critical state. I'm asking for all your prayers to bring my little man back to me. As tributes continue to be laid here at the memorial at Southport, right on the Broadwater, friends and families of the victims are coming to terms with their grief and the shock of what happened here on Monday. Very emotional day. There was a lot of stories being told, and there was a lot of tears shed. On the Broadwater today, helicopters hummed overhead. Too much for Dusty Ollerman, who was a close friend of Pilot Ash. A bit hard watching the other choppers in the air at the moment. Yeah, I'm just thinking that. It's a bit upsetting. Today, air crash investigators arrived at the Gold Coast University Hospital to speak with family and possibly the surviving pilot.
We need to know what was going on. We have one pilot who has survived. He will give an account. There is no way that this tragedy should ever have happened.
It is raw and confronting, this whole story, and of course the vision that has just come to hand for 7 News showing inside the chopper that did manage to land, and all of those people on board have managed to survive, although many are still in hospital, shows, what exactly happened. It was just a calm joy flight over Southport. The pilot is tapped on the shoulder to be warned what was coming, and of course then the collision happens. And now that sort of vision and many others, the Australian Transport and Safety Bureau, Sam, they'll get a hold of that and really start to try and piece together exactly how this whole thing has unfolded.
It's just chilling. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, So as you can see, I pinched that from Channel 7 News. Now I'm about to put the Biggles hat on, which would be this one here. My badge of authority in all things aeroplanological. Me being an aeroplanologist as I am. My handlebar moustache may have seen better days since it had its encounter with the linear accelerator. But I do still have a flying helmet and goggles, and I've got my own silk scarf and my grandfather's silk scarf, so all is not lost. However, we're going to go talking about helicopters, and you really don't need a flying helmet to play with a helicopter, not that I've ever noticed. So although the artefact does exist, and perhaps it lends some air of authority to my pontifications, I should probably rely on some other artifactual basis. So, here we go. How's that? Helicopter promotions. I'll see if I can get better light. There we go, helicopter promotions. This has got the old Bell 47J. Not the G3B1 that everybody's used to when they think of Bell 47. The Bell 47J, the presidential model. It had 3 seats across the wall behind the pilot, the back of the cockpit. The pilot sat up front in the bubble. When I first met her, Captain Rosemary Harris, Australia's first woman helicopter pilot, she had one of them that charter photographic tourist flights, joyrides and parachute drops. And yeah, there you go. Christopher J. Wharton, Manager, Sales and Marketing. What a blast from the past that is. Obi-Wan Kenobi, and if you thought that the pink business card that she had printed up for me at her expense on her numerologist's advice as to how to run the business of the Christopher J. Wharton, as to how to describe me. But anyway, this is definitely my reference from back in the day, saying, you know, what a good bloke I was back then. Just feast your eyes on the lady's signature, would you? Captain Rosemary Arnold Harris. And that was her official registered signature. Okay, so there you go. Now you know. Here we have an artefact which has in fact seen better days indeed. Believe it or not, that there is me in 1979. So at 18. That is Rosemary Arnold Harris, Australia's first woman commercial helicopter pilot. And that there behind us is VH-IYR, a 3-seat piston-engined Enstrom F-28C. And that's what Rosemary got after she got rid of the Bell 47J. And it's got a nose on it somewhat similar to the Aerospatials that crashed up at the Gold Coast. So I may refer back to this plate, which is at this distance of time, you know, what are we talking? 43 years down the track, this artefact is suffering from failure of the photographic emulsion. I probably should have sprayed hairspray on it 10 years ago. But anyway, it's because of the 4 or 5 months I spent working for Rosemary Arnold Harris, selling helicopter joyrides and navigating and refueling and flight planning and surveying helipads for possible projected operations, or to drop Santa Claus into a Christmas party, or do all manner of other things you did with the charter helicopter in the Sydney Basin in 1979. Because of all that, therefore, thus and because, this old hillbilly is going to venture to pass an opinion or two on the goings on and the doings that happened at the Gold Coast just so very, very recently. Okay, be aware this is not more or less to scale, it's just a sketch map, but it gives you a rough idea that if you're going to set up a helipad on an impromptu basis somewhere else, away from an airport, away from controlled airspace, don't even think about it unless you can get a 500 metre clearing, and in the middle of that you're going to have a 100 metre actual helipad. You want to fence around that area to keep the public at bay. And then 500 metres away should be your nearest obstacle below 20 metres. And that gives you a 10-degree climb out and approach path for your heavily loaded helicopter full of passengers to arrive and depart. That's kind of the bare basic minimum. From what I could see, these people had a heliport on the edge of a body of water, which I imagine is an estuary. People speak of Southport. People speak of the Brisbane River. I live in northern New South Wales. I'm not a Queenslander, so I really can't speak to that. Golly gosh, forgive the heaviness of the pen with which I wrote wind. It's a 3mm and not a 1mm. Anyway, the point is, here we have a rough approximation of 2 different tracks, which are going to give you a 3-minute circuit out of your selected helipad. And ideally, you will have the takeoffs going into the wind, right? Everything likes taking off into the wind. It gives you a lower ground speed. It flies much more betterer. However, when you are joyriding, time is critical. Helicopters are viciously expensive. Back in the day, to operate that little 3-seat Enstrom, it cost us $2 a minute. Our charter rate hourly was $185. So it was basically, we cost us $2 a minute. We charged out $3 a minute. Joyride tickets were $9.50 per person. So passenger number 1 pays $9.50 for a 3-minute joyride, which is $3 a minute. So they've paid basically the standard $185 or $180 an hour charter fee. But they've only had to pay it for 3 minutes. Anybody else who wants a 1-hour minimum charter, wants a charter for longer than the 3-minute joyride, they had to pay a 1-hour minimum fee. Okay, so your joyride gets you 3 minutes at normal charter rate. If I could line the second passenger up to get in there, great. That means the first passenger, you make 33% of your cash flow on them is profit. The second passenger, 100% of the cash flow on them is profit. If you can get 2x2 going in all day, that's great, but you have to put fuel in the helicopter. And if you've got the helicopter full of fuel, it can't lift 2 fat people. Now, these people are using turbine-powered helicopters, which usually don't have any kind of a lift penalty imposed by just having people sit in them. But people have been getting heavier in the last 44 years. And before we got it, that Enstrom F-28C was in the hands of a different pilot flying for a different company. He was taken off out of a Christmas party at a football club, and he had 2 big, heavy front row forward footballers on board and full fuel, and he was taken off into the wind. And it's good to be taken off into the wind because the wind increases the airspeed relative to the ground speed, so he was going fairly slow over the ground as he was taken off and managing to climb. And the wind suddenly died out, and he discovered that out of ground effect, he wasn't going fast enough to be able to maintain height. And he crashed onto 2 Mercedes cars and a Rolls Royce in the car park. So the tail cone of it used to sit in Illawarra Aviation's hangar, propped up against the wall, still with the registration IYR on it, when I was operating with Rosemary. So I got sidetracked, forgive the segue. I used to be very enthusiastic about all this sort of stuff. Now, the point is, if you give your passenger a 3-minute figure 8, a 3-minute circle, all they get to do is sit at a constant bank angle, and it's a fairly gentle bank angle. And you're going to take 3 minutes to cover 3 miles, right, 5 kilometres at 100 kilometres an hour, 60 miles an hour. And it's steady and slow and staid, and it's boring as batshit. And if the passenger is obviously afraid of flying, that might be what you want to do. But most of the time, most people want some more excitement than that. They're paying through the nose. I mean, $3 a minute was a lot. $3.30 a minute was a lot in 1979. So if you give them a figure 8, what they get is 2 270 degree, or 280 degree turns, or 200 degree turns sort of thing, because they're more than 180, in 2 different directions. And they get disoriented because they turn steeper in opposite directions. and they feel a bit more excited because they're a bit disoriented, and they land feeling like they've had a really good deal. They're not disconsolate or upset or dissatisfied. So if you're joyriding and if you can do it, you want to fly a figure eight. Now these people, they were flying down at the coast, and while it might be nice to be able to take off and land into the wind, down at the coast, if you're flying out of a fixed base tourist operation like Seaworld, then you've got to accept the fact that you're going to have a built-up municipal area with all of the casinos and hotels and motels and flashy, shiny-looking tourist traps and fast food and bars and everything that goes with it. You're going to have that on one side of you, and you're going to have the Pacific Ocean on the other side of you, and you might have to basically fly in and out of a departure corridor. You won't be able to come in and land over the top of the casinos and the hotels. The Chamber of Commerce won't stand for that. You're going to have to go out and do all your joyriding out here. So you're probably going to be taking off and turning and going out and either coming back in there or going out and coming back down here. So let's just say that's enough of tripods and diagrams, plates with old photos. Now, the first thing that sticks out to me is that we were flying a 3-seat helicopter, so Rosemary had 2 passengers. Very occasionally there'd be a small, lightweight adult and 2 very young children, and we would illegally put 2 children under one seatbelt and fly the 3 of them. But it was a bit iffy, and the pilot relies on the person selling the joyride tickets to make an accurate assessment of how much fuel the helicopter's burned since last time it was refueled, how much went in that time, which gives them a starting base of how much fuel has been burned, what the actual lift capacity is at the moment based on the temperature of the day and the barometric pressure, and what the ticket seller knows about helicopters. If the ticket seller doesn't know what they're doing, they can quite easily get passengers with a high level of expectation and anticipation out at the door of the helicopter, and the pilot's got to try and say, no, take one of them back, I can't do both of them, they're too heavy. So the decision is made on every particular payload, but it means the pilot, with no introduction, is getting brand new customers, paying passengers. And there's this fairground type of a ride where the pilot has got to fly the helicopter, and bear in mind, officially, helicopters are considered to be 2.5 times or 3 times more tiring and difficult and complicated to fly compared to a fixed-wing aeroplane carrying the same load. It'll have probably 2 or 3 times the power of a fixed-wing aeroplane carrying the same load at the same speed. And autopilots have come a long way since the days when I knew about helicopters. Back in those days, they couldn't make an autopilot that could fly a helicopter. Now they can. So I won't go into that whole rave. But the point is, you don't fly joyrides on autopilot. You're going to be hemmed in by the built-up area that you don't want to fly over that because you'll get noise complaints. You're going to be hemmed in by the controlled airspace over the Gold Coast Jet passenger airport. So you might not be allowed to go above 1,000 feet, and you're probably not allowed to come down below 500 feet. So you're going to be flying within a fairly fixed little patch of airspace off the coast. And with helicopters, just like with motor cars, there are certain blind spots. Now, I looked at that video a couple of times, and from what I can see, the person who noticed the speck that was getting bigger and bigger on the windscreen, they were sitting on the midline of the helicopter, and they were pointing off to the right, their right of the midline. And the pilot, he was sitting to the left and across over here sort of thing. And what the passenger sitting behind and to the right of the pilot could see through the perspex, I'm assuming that pilot couldn't see it because what he could see was I'm assuming it's aluminium, but it might be carbon fibre. Whatever it is, it's really bloody strong, the central former of the windscreen. of the aerospatial helicopter. The whole airframe on that thing is mainly carbon fibre. I think the floor might be aluminium. The bulkheads might be aluminium. The rotor head is half fiberglass. So there's a lot of composite material in it. So the pilot didn't see it in his blind spot. The pilot of the other helicopter, he was climbing, and you got to remember that helicopters suck themselves up and they suck themselves forward. So if you're taking off, he'd only taken off 20 seconds earlier, he'd broken ground or commenced the actual climb out. So he's not in an established cruise with the nose only a little bit down, chop, 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 with most of his rotor lifting up and some of it lifting forward. You don't need much forward momentum to keep a helicopter going. No, he was accelerating and he was climbing. So that means he will have had the nose tucked over fairly well in order to have the lift perpendicular to where he wanted to go. Yeah, it's a bit tricky to line up his lift vector with where he wanted to go, which is not straight up, but forward and up. The nose of the helicopter has to drop, and you use a lot more throttle and a lot more collective pitch, and you suck yourself up like that. You don't climb nose up like an ordinary aeroplane. Helicopters climb either flat or slightly nose down. So the pilot of the other helicopter, he's climbing, but his nose is slightly tucked down because he's trying to accelerate to cover as much ground in his, I think they're doing a 5-minute minimum joyride circuit up there. So with his nose tucked down, as he's climbing and he's going up in that direction, he's going to have the top of his perspex down pretty close, just above his horizon, and he can't actually see where he's going either. Although he's got a window above his head, he's not accelerating hard enough to tuck over and get the window over his head, showing him a view of where he's going. So both these pilots were effectively blind to the presence of each other. I think the other comment that I think is probably worth making is that that central rib there, which you can see on this helicopter, it survived the impact of the blade, which smashed all the perspex on the whole front of the helicopter, and the whole front of the cowling down there was smashed, yet the rudder pedals, or tail rotor control pedals, were still intact, and the pilot was sitting on the left-hand side. That's why I thought we might have to use this plate again. So, bearing in mind that this is an American-built helicopter, and American-built helicopters, if you can see up there, it's got its tail rotor sticking out on the left-hand side of the helicopter. That's because of the direction its rotors go. French do things differently, so their helicopters have the main rotors go in the opposite direction. So, therefore, when you're in an American helicopter, it's very difficult for you to see, but this is the trailing edge of that blade, which retreats on that side, whereas this is the leading edge, and this is the leading edge, right? So if you're sitting in it, looking up, the blades go across from your right to your left, okay? If it's a French helicopter, they go the other way, all right? So that sort of means that for a helicopter which is approaching, its rotor blades are going to be traversing the windscreen from left to right. And the angle of the dangle and the coincidence of the two aircraft's bank angles was apparently such that the rotor blade came up from below the disc angle of the surviving helicopter, and the leading edge of the blade has gone straight across the perspex at the front. Now, whether it went that way or that way or that way, I can't tell you. But I'm more or less gathering it might have gone horizontally across like that, which would indicate that the other helicopter was turning to the right, and this one was either straight and level, or well, level and descending, or perhaps turning to to the left. Don't know, but it looked like it was turning to the left from the footage on the camera of the passenger, but I know that the approaching rotor blade was moving in that direction, and it hasn't sort of dug in and chopped holes. It hasn't gone beyond that structural member just below the perspex. All the way up, it's taken out the perspex, it's taken out the nose, and it hasn't contacted the rotor. So if you think about the angle of the dangle and the speed and the velocity and the momentum and the interception angles and all the rest of it, clearly the 5 people who survived, there was a pilot and there was a passenger and there was 3 other people. So 5 people who survived on that helicopter. They live in the best of all possible worlds. It would have been nice for them if they hadn't been in the prang. But seeing as they were in the prang and they couldn't avoid that, apparently, owing to blind spots and a couple of other issues that we will discuss, they had the best possible outcome. They got the shit frightened out of them. But they're pretty much okay. The 2 survivors in the other aircraft, well, I'm assuming that the front of the aerospatial helicopter, they look like sort of a version of a twin squirrel with a fenestron tail. But I'm assuming that it must be largely laminated carbon fibre, the entire shell of it, and that structural member would be carbon fibre. And when the carbon fibre blade hit the carbon fibre shell of the helicopter, it would have made contact along there, all the way down that edge, along there. It would have made heavy contact through the top of the instrument panel as it scraped along, banged into that central member, continued across, and because of the angle of incidence of the blade striking it, it hasn't dug in. It sort of skated across the top, smacked it, smashed it to the shithouse, and of course the shock loading going back along the blade to the mast and into the gearbox has just ripped the entire gearbox and mast assembly straight out of the other helicopter, which has pulled it more or less at that angle out of the picture, so that the entire offending rotor blade, the rotor array, rotating in that plane, I'm thinking, it's just smacked onto that and skated down there, so it's pretty flat across the windscreen, but it's made its contact coming up from below, and then it's been unloaded. Hasn't got the helicopter hanging off it anymore, so the rotor and the gearbox will have just exited that way, twang, and then probably having damage, severe damage on that one blade, it will have then gone unstable and fallen out of the sky. If the blade that actually hit had gone across the top of the windscreen and everything had kept moving for another 1/3 of a revolution, which would be quite a 50th of a second kind of thing, I'm betting that the next blade would have come in through the side of the front end of the cockpit, and it would have just chopped the 2 front seat passengers in half, cut their legs off and cut their chests off. Wherever it hit, it would have gone straight through them. So yeah, they had the best day they could possibly have had, allowing for the setup. And the setup is a little bit cowboy risque in appearance in my eyes, because we always were solo operators. We never had to fly helicopter joyrides out of a paddock with anybody else there. Biggest day was 135 passengers, I think it was, in 72 landings. It might have been 138. We flew from Bankstown to Carcoar. We stayed overnight at Carcoar. We flew all day Saturday and did 138. I think we did about another 50 or 60 on the Sunday, and then we flew home. And by the time we covered the cost of the ferry flight there and back, we broke even on the whole trip. That was with me getting 50 cents a head commission on the joyrides and a $50 a week retainer. Paying $40 a week to board, couch surfing at my boss's house in whichever one of the bedrooms of her three daughters was vacant on the night, and I didn't have to sleep on the lounge room couch. But yeah, that was the exciting life of a helicopter joyride salesman in the 1970s. But the point is, we were always operating a solo outfit. We didn't have two aircraft to try and coordinate. And in another life, I once upon a time used to be launch control safety officer for an outfit that was aero towing Rogallo hang gliders behind ultralights, and sometimes we would operate from an airfield where there would be 130 hang gliders and maybe 50 or 60 ultralights and a dozen general aviation fixed wing aeroplanes, all operating out of a single runway dirt airport, uncontrolled. Um, so I know how busy an uncontrolled airport can be, and I know that if you get a few ground rules going, it's pretty safe. And if you've got a prevailing wind direction and a circuit direction, and everybody takes off in the correct direction and lands in the correct direction and circuits in the correct direction, then you can even run parallel operations with the ultralight hang glider combinations towing off the grass and the ultralights and the heavy metals taking off from the center of the center of the runway. Can be done. My job there was using a radio to talk to my pilot and basically tell him to drop the tow rope if the hang glider pilot was out of control below 300 feet. Above 300 feet, they were too far for me to be in control, but below 300 feet, the pilot's busy looking at the instruments in the horizon and flying the tow plane. The hang glider pilot busy trying to fly the hang glider, but they've got no roll control beyond weight shift, and if they can't shift far enough, they can get locked out by having too much yaw. And yeah, they just turn upside down and then they pitch out and then they punch into the ground. So my job was to call for a release when they had enough time to regain control before they got to 90 degrees, and then they would peel around and land and pay us $10 for the learning experience and go and try again. So I've had a bit to do with it, and having both wrangled helicopter joyride customers and been the interface between the customers and the helicopter and the pilot, and operated hang gliders, ultralights on the interface as ground staff. Like I wasn't flying any of these machines. I was just making sure that they didn't bloody crash because of fuck ups on the ground. I would say what you need is somebody with a pair of binoculars and a two-way radio to the pilots of the two helicopters. Now, whether it's a VHF, got to have all your licenses, Civil Aviation Authority regulated radio, or whether they just have a UHF radio on one of the 40 channels on a sideband somewhere where nobody else goes, so that there's somebody on the ground whose job is to pay attention to when each aircraft was fueled, keep a running tab of what its lift capacity is with the fuel that you calculate is still in it, how long it can continue operating before it needs to be refueled. Yes, all this is the job of the pilot, but the pilot is actually negotiating the airspace, dealing with the turbulence and looking out for birds and talking to the passengers. So it's very nice if somebody else can do this. And if that other person is also tasked with paying attention to which aircraft took off and where they're going, what they're doing, then you can avoid this idea of two pilots in two aircraft both talking to their paying customer passengers being fairground tour ride operators, go through the same approach departure point on the approach departure corridor down to a tight little helipad underneath the controlled airspace of the Gold Coast Jet passenger terminal and right up beside the tourist trap of the Gold Coast casinos and motels. It's the sort of operation that you could get away with if you only were doing it once or twice, but this was at Seaworld on the Gold Coast. I have a feeling they probably run like this at least Christmas and Easter and probably all school holidays. Maybe all through the summer. I don't know. When you haven't had anything to do with helicopter joyriding for 43 years, you don't know what's happening. But once upon a time, if you were able to make a living at it, you had to bloody know everything there was to know about it, even if you were just selling tickets. So, from what I can see, nobody was doing anything illegal. The pilots concerned have glowing reputations as being excellent, wonderful people. Excellent, wonderful pilots with wonderful records. But somewhere there was a bean counter who just didn't ever intuit the need to have a micro air traffic controller for that heliport. Because 5 passengers, maybe 6 if you got little kids and you can squeeze them in or something. I don't know. I'm pretty sure one of those things, it had 6 people on board when the incident happened. I think it might be the one that hit the ground, because there's 4 dead and 2 injured in that one. So that means 6 people. That means a pilot and 5 passengers in what I would think of as 3 seats across the back, 1 passenger seat and 1 pilot. So where the extra person fitted in, I don't know. But like I said, you get that. If you can charge the extra seat ticket and put a little person in there along with a skinny adult and get 4 across the back under 3 seat belts, I would not be surprised to hear that happens. Although maybe it was a bigger upgraded helicopter with extra lift capacity, and maybe it had extra seats on it. Maybe it had an enlarged cabin with 2 seats across the back, 2 seats facing backwards. I don't know. But I do know that, if you keep trying to force your helicopter to feed itself and to feed you and to cover all of its operating costs by carrying joyrides, you are constantly going to be operating on the feathery edge of cutting too many costs and shaving off too much of the corners, and finally, eventually, you get frightened. We got frightened one day. Something was going on in the turbocharger control unit, and there had been times when at engine RPMs below 2,700, the engine would spontaneously quit, but you didn't ever fly with your engine going that slowly. You flew at about 3,000 and the 3,300 sort of thing. So that was down the coast, and we went up to Carcool to the Ben Hall Festival, and we took off, and we had the luggage locker full of fuel, and I had 2 or 3 jerry cans under my feet in the front passenger well. We had full tanks because we were going to joyride all day. And when we got to Carcool, basically the town is on the banks of a creek which runs in a big horseshoe around the town, and down there was a hospital, and we'd been flying there the previous day and making a lot of noise, and they couldn't see us. And the idea was to go over and try and fly over the top of the hospital where the patients there could at least see us. It had been a verbal request put in by the staff. So we get there, and there's a wind blowing onto a hill, and we're over the top of the hill, and we would have been in the dead man's curve were it not for the wind. And the wind's blowing at us at 10 or 15 miles an hour. So we got 10 or 15 miles an hour speed. So we're not actually sitting still as far as the helicopter is concerned. But we are very heavily loaded, and we are only about 100, 150 feet above the top of the hill. We should be at least 300 feet above terrain when hovering, all that sort of dead man's curvy stuff. And then suddenly the wind stopped, and Rosemary reached for a handful of throttle and some left pedal, which increases the pitch on the tail rotor, which takes power out of the engine, and she ran out of throttle, and we got into rotor decay and started to descend. And in rotor decay, what happens is, because you're going vertically down, the air coming vertically up through the centre of the rotor means it's got too high an angle of attack to be actually lifting, and the centre of the rotor stalls, and when it stalls, it becomes harder to turn, so your engine slows down even more. and it lifts even less, so the stall progresses out, and that's called rotor decay. And the further it progresses, the faster you go down and the harder the rotor becomes to turn. So there we were, sort of first above the hill and then level with the hill and spinning to the right and going down into the valley, and at the bottom of the valley there was the river with trees around it, and it was all pretty scary. And all I could think of to do was open the door and prepare to throw these 2 jerry cans under my feet out the door, because 80 pounds of fuel would be better out than in, sort of thing, if you've got to sit in the front of a helicopter that's going into a river. However, just as we got to the point where we were going between the treetops over the creek, a gust of wind hit us and suddenly gave us enough airspeed to have enough translational lift that we didn't need to be going down anymore, and Rosemary was able to get us to fly straight along the river about 6 feet up, and we picked up speed there, and then we were able to climb up, and I didn't throw the fuel out, so we were able to go over and land at the Joyride spot and carry on with our day as if nothing had been untoward. Rolled our eyebrows at each other and thought about what a near miss we had had. But yeah, that's what helicopter joyriding can be like. And yeah, for these people up at the Gold Coast, their cowboy setup went one day too long, and the blind spots got the better of them, and they didn't have anybody on the ground with binoculars, and each pilot was trying to do 3 jobs at once. They were trying to fly the helicopter, they were trying to pay attention to where the other helicopter was and what its pilot might be doing, so that they could avoid flying into the other person's airspace, and they were talking to the passengers. And yeah, 2 helicopters went bang, splat, tinkle, splash, flop. And I think the Civil Aviation Safety Authority will just have to look into that. They'll have to redraw a few regulations, and either they'll have to ban multiple joyride aircraft operating from uncontrolled helipads, airports perhaps, or they'll have to regulate mandating the presence of a paid observer to coordinate the operations of multiple aircraft if more than one is to be used. Because I mean, air traffic control at uncontrolled airports, it's not bloody rocket science. You know, they used to have 60 or 100 Tiger Moths flying around training airfields with no radios in the 1940s. And there were the occasional mid-air collisions, but very, very, very rarely, because there are basic rules. You can go gliding in modern aircraft with radios, but there's no control tower telling the sailplane pilots where to go and when to go there. There are just rules. You know, there are rules as to which direction you fly a circuit at the airport. There are rules as to which direction you turn when you go into a thermal. But that's all off topic. Point is, that heliport should have had someone with binoculars and a radio link to the 2 pilots to keep them from running into each other while they were being nice to the fare-paying passengers. In hindsight, in the opinion of someone who's had nothing to do with the industry for 43 years. That's how long it is since I sold a helicopter joyride. I've been on a few helicopter joyrides since then when my kids were little. So it's not as if I'm completely unaware of the experience from a customer's point of view. But yeah, not your normal crash analysis, I guess. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Have a good one. Can you believe what a Biggles fanatic I used to be in the way back when? Ciao.